Hello, Guilty Feminist. This is one of our special bonus episodes, and our guest is an award-winning investigative journalist at The Guardian who has spent years reporting on power, gender, and the internet. Her latest podcast series examines the language of autonomy, the realities of maternity care, and the ways online communities can shape women's most intimate decisions. Please welcome to the show, Sirin Kale. Sirin, can you tell us the story you're telling in this podcast? What can you tell us about it?
Sure. So The Birth Keepers is a 6-part investigative podcast, which is hosted and written by myself and my reporting partner, Lucy Osborne from The Guardian. And it is about an organisation called the Free Birth Society, which is a multi-million-dollar business which is headquartered in the US, which has promoted a really radical version of free birth, which is giving birth without any medical assistance, and has really caught fire all around the world. And during the course of our reporting, Lucy Osborne, my reporting partner, and I unfortunately found that FBS, the Free Birth Society, had been linked to quite a lot of serious harm involving mothers tragically losing their babies or almost dying themselves.
God. How did you first find out about this story?
So Lucy and I both became really interested in the social media commentary around birth. We both had children around the same time. And I think many women listening to this who have had children themselves in the Instagram era will be able to relate to the fact that it's like the algorithm knows you're pregnant almost before anyone else does.
Mm.
And we were really interested by the ways in which some of these big social media accounts, which seem very legitimate, were sometimes pumping out really extreme misinformation. And FBS, the Free Birth Society, is one of the biggest social media accounts out there talking about birth. It's got 132,000 followers. And when you go on the FBS Instagram account, you see these really amazing videos of women having these incredibly beautiful free births at home. And there's something incredibly captivating and compelling about that. And then what it does is it slipstreams you into, I would say, more radical, more extreme anti-medical views. So many women we spoke to for our reporting told us that having never considered free birth before, the algorithm pulled them towards FBS, and then they decided to give birth with no medical assistance at all after following it on Instagram and interacting with its content and listening to its really popular podcast. So to answer
And
your
when you
question,
say no medical intervention at all, do you mean no one on hand, or do you mean no midwife? No, what do they mean by that?
nothing. Like, you are at home with your partner, a friend, but there is nobody helping you deliver your baby who has any medical training whatsoever. So
And
free
what
birth.
if you are in an emergency situation? You shouldn't call an ambulance?
So FBS is founded by a woman called Emily Saldea, and she runs the organisation with assistance from her business partner, Yolanda Norris-Clark. And they would say, of course, in an emergency situation, you should reach out and call 911. But what they do is they often downplay the likelihood of these emergencies happening or the seriousness of these emergencies. Um, you know, if you're in an emergency situation and you are free birthing, then your only option really is to get in a car and go to hospital or call 911. So when you free birth, which is something that people get confused with home birth a lot, you are giving birth with no medical assistance whatsoever. Whereas with a home birth, you've got a midwife there who is somebody who is trained and can deliver your baby.
And I read in The Guardian your article about this, that there are people who say that ultrasounds cause autism and it discouraged people from having any prenatal care. Is that correct?
Yeah, so one of the things about FBS, the Free Birth Society, is that although from its Instagram account and from its podcast, it seems quite mainstream, the branding is of a particular aesthetic, which I think most people who spend a lot of time on Instagram will recognize as very kind of woman friendly and empowering. Um, Actually, the two women behind the organization have really extreme views. And what's really interesting about FBS is that it promotes a version of free birthing that many women find to be very extreme. And these women that are pro free birth, women have a legal right to free birth. It's your right to have your baby however you want to have it. And it's legal to free birth in most countries in the world. But FBS has popularized this really extreme version of free birthing that I would almost liken to an extreme sport. So it's promoted this term called wild pregnancy. So a wild pregnancy is a pregnancy with no prenatal care at all. Some women who practice wild pregnancy, often after finding out about it through FBS, don't even take pregnancy tests. So they don't know how pregnant they are at all. You are truly going into your labour and your birth with no information about your pregnancy at all. You don't know if you're having twins. You don't know whether your baby's head down. You don't know if you've got conditions like gestational diabetes or preeclampsia. Um, and this, of course, increases the risks for mothers during births. And sadly, during the course of our reporting, we found that women who had had wild pregnancies did go on to have really sad, really negative outcomes, which sadly involved losing their babies.
Oh, God. And is this coming from the same kind of place of the anti-vax movement? This idea of eschewing science, eschewing medicine? Because I do understand if people have had a bad experience in a hospital, if people have had a bad experience with a previous pregnancy where they did everything that the hospital and the doctors told them to do, that they may wish to withdraw, and this could seem, very like a sort of safer place. Did you kind of explore what's going on underneath as to why people are drawn to this?
Oh, completely. And it's such a good question. And it's hard to give you a short answer, although I'd love to give you a short answer, Deborah. But I think there's like a small minority of women who will always free birth. Like it's just something that they feel like really cool to do. And they might not even know what free birth is. They just have this really clear, really intuitive sense that they don't want anyone else there when they're having their babies. And often these are women who have had quite a few pregnancies before. And they're very confident in their ability to give birth, and they know how to give birth, and they're also confident in their ability to know if something's going wrong. Um, but what FBS popularized, I think, was this idea of free birthing being something that you should aspire towards if you've
Mm.
never had a baby before. And we know that your risks during labor and birth increase if you're a first time mother. Some of the women who were choosing to free birth that we spoke to were doing so not because it was their first choice, but because they had to. Many of the women we spoke to were American, and they have a healthcare system which is obviously very different to our own. It can be really difficult to get home birth midwives. You have to pay out of pocket. In some cases, women were being charged $5,000 to get a home birth midwife, which is obviously a huge sum of money.
Mm.
And with free birth, right, the clue's in the name, it's free. So in some instances, women we spoke to would have much rather given birth at home with a midwife, but they couldn't afford the out-of-pocket fees for that
Mm.
midwife, or they live somewhere where there's not many midwives in the area. Like if you live in a remote part of Canada, for example, it's often very poorly served by midwives. But a big factor, and I really cannot overstate the importance of this, I think, is birth trauma. So, here in the UK, I think we're all very aware of the fact that the NHS is really not doing such a great job when it comes to taking care of women, both physically but also emotionally and mentally during their
Mm.
births.
And just to be clear, there's so many hardworking people in the NHS, and it is underfunding in the main that is going on. So I don't want anyone to listen to this and go, "We're trying really hard." We know that you need to be funded better. That continue, Sharon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more. I think it's more than just funding. Unfortunately, I think that there are bigger systemic problems within the NHS when it comes to maternity care, but I think funding is a huge part of it.
Do you think it's attitude or old practices or not putting the mother or other parent first?
Honestly, we've had so many reviews now. We've had the Ockenden review. We've had Bill Kirkup. We've had multiple reviews now, and I think they all identify this as really multifactorial. I think there's partly conflicting approaches to how is best to give birth. I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I don't want to get too much into NHS maternity care because that's not the
Mm.
focus of our reporting. But I think to go back to my point about trauma, here in the UK, in America, in Canada, like we have different problems, but what is uniform across all of this is that women are emerging from their births feeling completely brutalized. They're feeling that they're not being listened to, that they're not being
Mm.
respected, they're not having procedures performed on them with consent. This is
Mm.
like really basic stuff, right? Like you need to secure consent, informed consent before you perform a procedure on women. I can't tell you how many women I spoke to who said things like, I had a membrane sweep performed on me without consent. It was just done to me. And so if you are leaving hospital feeling that you had a traumatic birth, that you had interventions performed on you, in some cases surgeries like C-sections that you didn't actually need, and that you really leave feeling like you barely survived your birth, like it was so incredibly traumatic, and then you're told, oh, well, you've got to be happy because you have a healthy baby, and that's all that really matters. Then I completely understand why you would go so far the other way and want to stay away from hospitals entirely. And I
Mm.
think FBS, part of the appeal was this idea that you don't need to go into hospitals where you're not going to be listened to, you're not going to be respected. I think, particularly in the US, you have a very overly interventive system because you have privatized healthcare, you have insurance providers, everything's for profit, and you can maximize profit by performing interventions and surgeries. So these are also big factors in pulling women to the organization. And then finally, to answer your question, I definitely think COVID had an influence, absolutely. FBS was founded in 2017, but it really exploded in 2020, which was during the pandemic. And I think the pandemic eroded a lot of people's trusts in the mainstream medical system. A lot of people felt that the vaccine rollout was rushed and they didn't want to have it. And people were also just spending a lot of time online, right? Like it was a period where
Mm.
we were all on our phones. And so if you're running a social media business, it makes sense that a lot of people would come to you and form communities with other women online during this period, which, I mean, it was really frightening. It feels like a long time ago now, but people were really concerned. So it kind of all came together in this sort of maelstrom and birthed this business, this movement, which went on to go all across the world.
Wow. And can I ask, when did you realize how dangerous it was that, women were having such terrible outcomes?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because we actually don't know whether free birthing is dangerous or not dangerous because there's really no evidence or data on it whatsoever. What we can say, I think, is that the version of free birth popularized by FBS is associated with higher levels of risks to mothers and babies. And that's because it's, as I mentioned before, a really extreme version of free birth where women are going into their labours not even knowing if they're having twins or if their babies are head down. If you're practicing wild pregnancy, you're really flying blind. Um, and FBS also popularized, some practices that I think are really extreme. So within FBS, it became quite normal within the sort of inner private online community that they formed for women to go to even 44 weeks of pregnancy. There is this philosophy that like the baby will come when the baby will come. And of course, if you're going to 44 weeks of pregnancy, then that significantly increases the risk of stillbirth because that baby is, almost 11 months gestation. Um, and very sadly, we did see poor outcomes and we did see women losing their babies. And, we consulted experts during the course of our reporting and with women's consent sent them medical notes, case histories. And we found that some of these tragedies were avoidable.
Yeah. I mean, if there's no medical knowledge or expertise at all, we're basically going back to Victorian times, and we know what the numbers were then. You just have to read Victorian novels and accounts at the time, historical accounts at the time, to know how many women died in childbirth, how many babies didn't make it. Like it's pretty well documented that before we knew what we know, it was a very childbirth was the leading cause for women dying. So, you kind of have to ask why we would not use any medical interventions or just information, finding things out. As you say, are you having twins? Is the baby expected to come out the right way round? When would you need the baby to be induced if you do? Um, so that it makes total sense to me that, of course, if everybody went back to no intervention at all, we'd start to see the same mortality rates that we saw in the 1700s or the 1800s before we had the kind of medical advancements we have now. But it's very interesting that you're balancing that by saying some of the medical services that we have now do not make women feel, and other people who can give birth feel, listened to or respected, or and a, and some of those outcomes are not excellent either and can cause trauma. So it sounds like a very well-rounded piece. What have you what kind of response have you had from the podcast?
Yeah, and also just really quickly, just to what you just said, I think, was really interesting. And, you know, before we had doctors managing births, we had midwives. You know, if you look back for hundreds, if not longer, thousands of years, there were skilled women assisting other women giving birth. And yeah, they didn't go to medical school and they didn't have stethoscopes and white coats, but they were very knowledgeable. And many of the techniques that these community or indigenous midwives had are life-saving. And I think what FBS promoted was actually an idea that really hasn't actually been something that women have lived by ever. It's it's actually not part of our collective history to give birth completely alone. You know, if you go back a couple of hundred of years, if you go back a couple of hundred years, there would have been skilled midwives in the community who would have assisted women giving birth. So I think that's what's really fascinating for me as well, is that actually this kind of movement away from midwives is not something that we were doing before. Um, but it's really hard to assess exactly what level of risk is elevated by the practice of free birth that FBS popularised, because we just don't have any concrete statistical data on it. But what we do know is Lucy and I were able to speak with 18 women firsthand, and really assess and fact check their stories, and find that after engaging with FBS content during their pregnancies, they went on to experience serious harm. And those stories will really stay with us.
Are some of them very angry that they did it, that they were told to do it and they did it?
I don't know if anger is the right word. I think when you lose a baby, it's just the most devastating and heartbreaking thing you can possibly imagine. Um, and yes, in some instances, they really do feel like they received really poor information and they were misled by the Free Birth Society. But, the mothers that we spoke to also say, I did make that decision. I did choose to free birth, but unfortunately it was based on information that I now know is inaccurate. And Lucy and I, although The Birth Keepers is a podcast obviously about birth, we've always really seen this as a story about information and disinformation. And I think that we're we're both very agnostic on what is the quote unquote right way to give birth. Like, I think it's so personal. I don't think we should be in the business of compelling women to give birth a certain way. I certainly don't think free birth should be illegal. I think if a woman makes a decision to free birth based on looking at all of the evidence that is available and feeling that it is the right thing for her, then that's good for her. Like, that's her choice, that's her decision. But what we really felt that we wanted to do with the Birth Keepers was just provide people with accurate information, and also really look at some of the claims that FBS was making around birth, which were really inaccurate. And I think, fundamentally, if you make a decision that is based on good information, like real facts and accurate data, and it doesn't work out well for you, that's really sad and it's hard. But I think it's a lot easier to live with that decision than if you make a decision and you later find out that the basis of that decision was not accurate. So I really just think what I hope people take away from this project, from this podcast, is just to really think about the information that's being presented to you by people on the internet who might have a profit motive and a really narrow and extreme ideological position. And just think incredibly carefully about that, and whether they're giving you that information because they sincerely want you to have all the facts, or whether they're trying to sell you a product and service and not actually filter it through a really extreme worldview.
That sounds like very good advice. And we're now going to play a trailer from your podcast. And we hope people who are interested in this, who are coming up to giving birth, perhaps, and thinking about what their options are, will listen to it.
The Free Birth Society made millions selling a simple message to pregnant women. You don't need ultrasounds, doctors, or midwives. You can free birth. But behind the scenes, terrible things were happening.
I feel ashamed about this, but I didn't think that the deaths were bad until a year after I left.
Subscribe to The Guardian Investigates feed to get all the episodes of The Birth Keepers. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Out now.
Thank you so much, Sirin. It's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you. Where can we hear the podcast?
You can listen to The Birth Keepers wherever you get your podcasts, and it's on the Guardian Investigates feed.
Great. we will all be listening to that with much, much interest. Thank you so much, Sirin. You've been a fantastic guest.
Thank you for having me, Deborah.
Thank you.